Hey, I haven't made a video in a while, but here for this one, I will show my presentation that I'm doing for my class on magic and the occult in the early modern period, in which I talk about the magic in Shakespeare's plays. So here we go. So, William Shakespeare lived in a time when magic could be thought of as real and witchcraft was commonly believed in. The beliefs of 16th and 17th century England informed Shakespeare's own use of magic in his plays, from how magic was performed to the gender biases surrounding it, as seen in Macbeth, The Tempest, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, although I'll only be covering Macbeth and The Tempest for the sake of time. So Shakespeare combined both his own fancy and ideas with those of his time to create witches and sorcerers and fairies that perpetuate the now typical view of magic today. Okay, just to give a nice background of the beliefs and magic of Renaissance era England, first of all, Shakespeare lived from 1564 to 1616. The 1650s was a peak witch hunting craze, which means that Shakespeare was living and writing during a time where there was this acceleration towards more belief in witchcraft and witch hunting. From 1580 to 1628 and 1643 to 1700 were the periods of the most popular writings on witchcraft. And for the first period, Shakespeare was living and writing, so he had a lot of source material to look at for when he was writing his things on magic in his plays. So Francis Nielsen says in Shakespeare and The Tempest, "In London there were things rank and gross in nature. The devil was abroad day and night, and the legions who worked for him, witches, were here, there, and everywhere." So during that time, skeptics of witchcraft were very much akin to heretics, and witchcraft and the devil were very much commonplace. A lot of the English ideas of witchcraft and magic stemmed from actual folk traditions and weren't just these foreign ideas from the continent. It was really this mixture of Scottish witch beliefs and literary origins and classical allusions and native folk beliefs. Another factor in how England differed from mainland Europe is that England at that time was a Protestant country, whereas the majority of the European continent was Catholic, so they actually had the Inquisition going on, which kind of informed how the witch hunting went on, whereas England did not have that kind of formal Inquisition targeting witches. So the people who were often targeted as witches in Renaissance England were old, poor, and ignorant women, people who could easily be targeted and weren't seen as kind of fitting into society all that well. So for persecutions and convictions, although they saw evidence more akin to that you would find on the continent, they received a lot more evidence akin to folk tradition. And another difference is that they received a lot more convictions off of neighbors' evidence rather than witches' own confessions. Another thing it's interesting that I read was that they got a lot of evidence from the witches' children or stepchildren on animal familiars. Another thing that was kind of unique to England is that witches' meetings, like Sabbaths and direct contact with the devil, which was commonly believed in on the continent, it was only believed in northern England and Scotland initially, but it did happen to spread southward throughout the rest of the country as the century progressed. So, talking about Macbeth, which was written in 1606. So, Macbeth is a gunpowder play, meaning that it was written around the time of the gunpowder plot of 1605, which was a plot against King James. It was a group of Catholics who planned to blow up the king and his government by placing barrels of gunpowder beneath Parliament. And they were hoping to replace the Protestant king with a Catholic leader because there was this kind of rash of Catholic persecution going on with King James as a Protestant as leader. King James himself believed in witchcraft, and it was believed that the plotters themselves entered into a contract with the devil because Catholics and Jesuits were often connected with heresy, which was connected with witchcraft in turn, which kind of informed a lot of the plays at the time that were written. And a lot of them were known as gunpowder plays because they involved bringing in witchcraft in a political sense. For instance, in Macbeth, the witches prompt Macbeth to regicide. So, interestingly enough, with the play today, it carries its own superstition and is referred to as the Scottish play in theatre. And there is a supposed curse on the play that where you don't want to say Macbeth when you're performing it, or else horrible things will happen during production, which, interestingly enough, started happening when productions started cutting the Hecate scene, which was a scene where this goddess of witchcraft kind of instructs the witches on how to next deal with Macbeth. So once they started cutting that scene and figuring the magic and witchcraft and witches of the play as part of more of Macbeth's psyche rather than actual magical beings of a devilish kind of world, it kind of really took away from Shakespeare's original meaning of the play, which I think in turn kind of lent to this kind of curse where productions don't go off really smoothly, because I think in general a lot of people, when they put on the production, they don't think how that magic and those witches were very real to the people at the time. So now going from character to character basis, there are the wayward / weird sisters, depending on your your edition, the three witches. So they kind of confront the audience right away with magic from the very first scene of the play. They're meeting and prophesizing and doing all that stuff. So then from there, they kind of spin the entire play as this spell. So similarities between the witches of Macbeth and the supposed witches of Renaissance England. One common factor is that they were drawing the battlefields. It was thought that witches used dead bodies for parts, and it kind of also correlated with necromancy. And it was such a real problem at the time that forging through graves actually had the penalty of death. And it's also referenced in the play with the witches in the battlefield when they say when the battle's lost and won is when they're going to meet again. Another thing is animal familiars, as I mentioned earlier. A couple of familiars are referenced. There's Grey Malkin and Paddock. Another thing is this kind of witches' hypersexuality, as well as kind of sterilization of witches. One of the witches talks about how with a sailor she will drain him dry and sleep shall neither night or day, kind of referencing this kind of idea of this erotic magic of where you would keep your desired lover, your desired one, in pain and from sleep until they came to you. Another thing is weather. So it was thought that the devil worked on foul days and that midnight was kind of Hecate / witching hour, and that night and darkness enabled evil and crime. So with the witches, there's always storms and thunder preceding them before they come on, kind of referencing how they always work in foul days and in the darkness. And Macbeth himself even commits his first murder of King Duncan at night. Also, another reference is how the devil and the witches were connected in how the play Banquo says, I believe it's Banquo, what can the devil speak true when hearing the witches prophesy? So another thing is conjuring circles, which are referenced a few times in the play, with the weird sisters hand in hand, posters of the sea and land, thus to go about, round about the cauldron go, and now about the cauldron sing like elves and fairies in a ring. And I read in one of the books that at the time of the production, they would often, during the play, Macbeth would be encircled by this movement of the weird sisters, and this circle kind of entrapping him into these spells. Another thing that was often referenced was their appearance, which, like as I mentioned earlier, English witches were thought to be very old, ugly, poor, and such, and the weird sisters are referenced as being withered, wild, you should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so, and you secret black and midnight hags. So now on to Macbeth. So in the book Witches and Jesuits by Gary Wills, he kind of proposed an interesting idea that Macbeth as a male witch, because he steps over this boundary when he summons his occult knowledge and essentially negotiates with hell when he's conjuring and banning the witches and their powers. This can even be seen in the post-murder of Duncan, where he says, "But wherefore could not I pronounce Amen?" Kind of where he backed out of this contract of baptism with God, and he entered into this contract with devil instead, to where he can no longer pronounce holy things. And Macbeth is even referred to as a wayward son by Hecate, which has kind of a double meaning, as wayward as kind of deviating off the path of good, as well as the wayward sisters, which is very interesting. Now for Lady Macbeth. A lot of people consider her the fourth witch, but she technically and legally isn't a witch, despite her trying to become intimate with evil, which in the end kind of divides her and Macbeth and how he takes that leap, but she kind of remains there. Nevertheless, she does use a lot of witch talk. For instance, in her Unsex Me Here speech, she often references "come to my woman's breast and take my milk for gall," and also her speech on infanticide of taking baby suckling at her breast and knocking its head against the rocks or stones, which references the idea that witches would often eat babies or kill babies or steal babies for the devil. Okay, so now on to The Tempest, which was written from 1610 to 1611. So the main magician sorcerer is Prospero. He is shown to have command over the spirit Ariel. He's shown to have this ability to create storm at sea and this power over nature, kind of showing the occult virtues of nature. And he also has the ability to cause pain on people, rack thee with old cramps and fill all their bones with aches. It's also often suggested that Prospero was very learned and well-read, and at the time there was very little distinction between science and occultism. So the idea of the sorcerer and knowledge are very much correlated together. For instance, it's said that he's wrapped in secret studies, and Caliban says to remember first to possess his books, for without them he's but a sot, kind of leading to the idea that without books, without knowledge, his magic is nothing. He too uses a conjuring circle to its end to entrap his victims, and it's also referenced that the devil speaks in him. So the other magic user referenced in the play is Sycorax, a witch, although she is dead by the time of the play comes around. So we only hear about her from others, and it's all very negative. For instance, her appearance and association is referenced as the foul witch, damned witch, and blue-eyed hag. Her sexuality and her connection with the devil is all very much referenced, and how it's said that Caliban, her monstrous son, is said to have got by the devil himself upon thy wicked dam, and he's even referred to as a demi-devil, kind of referencing the idea that witches would enter into a contract with the devil by actually having sex with the devil. Okay, so to kind of conclude with Shakespeare's magic, this idea of men versus women, you can see how the bias of Renaissance England kind of entered into Shakespeare's own plays with magic. For instance, Macbeth versus the Weird Sisters and Lady Macbeth. The Weird Sisters are often kind of very spoken down towards and not treated very kindly at all by Macbeth. And even in modern days, Lady Macbeth is often viewed as evil, manipulative one who led Macbeth, kind of forced him into committing these murders, even though he is the one himself who actually entered into this contract with the devil and actually committed all these murders, which I kind of think shows this continuing bias of men and women in magic. Another example is with Prospero and Sycorax. Prospero is very much seen as this kind of wise, knowledgeable, older enigma of a man, whereas Sycorax is very much seen as this hag and this evil witch. As Maggie Carew says in The Magician of Shakespeare's The Tempest, in Shakespeare's day, female practitioners of magic are foul witches, while male magicians are virtuous and learned. And Shakespeare's own representation of magic is very present in today, and how it perpetuates from the idea of, you think of witches, you think of the three witches around the cauldron saying, double, double, toil and trouble. And you think of a sorcerer as being wise and knowledgeable and learned. So it's interesting to see how Shakespeare took influence from his day and time, and we now take influence from Shakespeare on our view of magic. That is my presentation on Shakespeare and magic, and I hope you learned something new, and I hope you read some Shakespeare, and thank you for watching.